A single man stands in an open turret as a machine gun screams beneath him. 40 German soldiers trapped in a trench with no escape. One decision that will turn a 4-day stalemate into a breakthrough. This is the story of Captain William Wiley Galt, a Montana rancher who understood something about warfare that the Army had forgotten, a story of geometry, desperation, and the terrible mathematics of killing at close range. By the time the .50 caliber Browning stops firing, the road to Rome will be open, but the man who opened it will be dead across his weapon, and history will forget almost everything about what happened on Hill 209. May of 1944. Italy. The war had been grinding through the mountains and rivers of the Italian peninsula for 9 brutal months since the Allied landings at Salerno. By January, the advance had stopped cold at a line the Germans called the Gustav Line, a defensive position so formidable that it had withstood months of Allied attacks, consuming thousands of lives without yielding meaningful ground. The Allies responded with Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio intended to outflank the German defenses and open the road to Rome. The landings on January 22nd succeeded tactically, achieving complete surprise, but Major General John Lucas, commanding the 6th Corps, chose to consolidate his beachhead rather than drive inland. The decision would be debated for decades. Within days, German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had surrounded the Allied beachhead with enough force to not only contain it, but to nearly destroy it. What followed was 4 months of siege warfare, a static nightmare of artillery barrages, air attacks, and failed breakout attempts that turned the coastal marshland into a death trap for tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. By May, the strategic situation had evolved. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, had been planning a coordinated offensive designed to break the stalemate at both Cassino and Anzio simultaneously. Operation Diadem would throw the full weight of the 5th and 8th Armies against the Gustav Line, while the forces bottled up at Anzio would break out and cut the German line of retreat. The offensive began on the night of May 11th with a massive artillery bombardment followed by infantry assaults across multiple sectors. British, American, Polish, and French forces attacked in waves, and by May 18th, the Gustav Line had finally cracked. The German 10th Army began a fighting withdrawal northward toward Rome, and on May 23rd, the Anzio beachhead erupted in its own offensive, designed to trap the retreating Germans before they could escape. But between the Anzio forces and their objectives lay the Caesar Line, the last prepared German defensive position south of Rome. It was incomplete in places, hastily constructed in others, but where it was properly manned and dug in, it was formidable. The Caesar Line ran from the coast north of Anzio eastward, through a series of hills and draws before turning southward toward Valmontone. Its purpose was simple: delay the Allied advance long enough for the German 10th Army to escape encirclement and establish new defensive positions north of Rome. The 34th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation drawn primarily from Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, had been fighting in Italy since September 1943. The division had earned a reputation for stubborn determination and had paid heavily for every yard of Italian soil it took. By late May, the division was operating northeast of the Anzio beachhead as part of the breakout offensive, tasked with cracking the Caesar Line in its sector. The 168th Infantry Regiment, one of the division's 3 infantry regiments, faced a particularly difficult objective. On the division's right flank stood 2 interconnected German strongpoints that dominated the surrounding terrain: Gennaro Hill and Villa Crochetta, a cluster of farm buildings sitting atop Hill 209. The ground leading to these positions was a tactical nightmare. To attack either strongpoint, American infantry would have to cross open wheat fields on neighboring hills, fully visible to German observers. Then they would descend into draws formed by tributaries of Presiano Creek, losing visual contact with their supporting weapons. Finally, They would have to assault up steep slopes toward prepared German positions that had been constructed according to the Wehrmacht's well-developed doctrine of defense in depth. The German defensive line on Hill 209 consisted of a trench system 5 to 6 feet deep running across the hilltop and continuing along the southern slopes of Gennaro Hill. This was not a hastily scratched position. German combat engineers had designed the trenches in a zigzag pattern to minimize the effects of enfilade fire and to create isolated strong points that could continue fighting even if adjacent positions were overrun. Machine gun positions had been carefully sited to command the draws and approach routes with interlocking fields of fire. Mortars were positioned in close support, pre-registered on likely approach routes and assembly areas. Wire obstacles had been emplaced, including wire nooses, trip wires, and single-strand barbed wire designed to slow and channel attacking infantry into pre-designated kill zones. The Germans manning these positions knew their business, and they had been given time to prepare properly. The weapons that dominated this defensive line were MG-42 machine guns, one of the most effective infantry weapons of the Second World War. The MG-42 fired the standard German 7.92 mm Mauser round at a cyclic rate that could exceed 1,200 rounds per minute, more than twice the rate of the American Browning 30 caliber machine gun. The sound was distinctive, a high-pitched ripping noise that American soldiers called Hitler's zipper. In defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, MG-42s created zones that were nearly impassable to infantry attacking across open ground. German machine gun doctrine emphasized grazing fire, keeping the beaten zone at ground level where advancing infantry could not avoid it by going prone. A well-trained German machine gun team with adequate ammunition could pin down an entire rifle company indefinitely. The defensive position at Villa Crochetta incorporated multiple MG-42 positions, each carefully sited to cover dead ground that might otherwise provide concealment to attackers. On May 28, 1944, the 1st Battalion of the 168th Infantry Regiment launched its first assault against Villa Crochetta. The attack followed standard infantry doctrine. Artillery preparation was followed by an advance across the open ground toward the German positions. The German response was immediate and devastating. Machine gun fire from the trenches on Hill 209 swept the wheat fields, and mortar rounds began falling on the advancing infantry. The Americans went to ground, tried to maneuver, found no covered routes of advance, and were forced to withdraw with casualties. The battalion reformed and attacked again later the same day. The result was identical. German defensive fire stopped the attack before it could close with the objective. That night, the battalion counted its losses and prepared for another attempt. The morning of May 29th began with a third assault. Again, the infantry advanced across the open wheat fields. Again, the German machine guns opened fire from prepared positions. Again, American soldiers died in the wheat without ever reaching the German trenches. By mid-morning, the situation had reached a critical point. 3 battalion-level attacks had failed to dislodge a German force that probably numbered fewer than 2 companies. The infantry was exhausted, depleted, and increasingly demoralized. Officers and sergeants who had survived the first attacks knew they would be ordered to try again, and they knew what would happen. Warfare has its own mathematics, and the equation facing the 1st Battalion was brutally simple. Infantry attacking prepared positions across open ground suffers casualties at a rate roughly 3 to 1 in favor of the defender, and that ratio worsens with each successive attack as the attackers become more exhausted, and the defenders more familiar with the approaches and killing zones. Without a fundamental change in tactics or the application of supporting weapons that could suppress the German machine guns, the next attack would fail just as the previous 3 had failed. At this point in the battle, a staff officer made a decision that would change the outcome. Captain William Wiley Galt served as the S3, the operations officer for the 1st Battalion. In military staff organization, the S3 is responsible for planning operations and coordinating the various elements of the battalion in combat. It is a staff position, not a command position. The S3 works at the battalion command post, not at the front line. Captain Galt's job was to translate the battalion commander's intent into specific orders, to coordinate artillery support, to track the location and status of the battalion's companies, and to maintain communication with higher headquarters. It was a demanding position that required tactical acumen and the ability to function under pressure, but it did not require, and did not normally involve, leading infantry assaults personally. Staff officers planned attacks, rifle company commanders executed them. This was the established division of labor, and it existed for sound reasons. A battalion operations officer possessed knowledge and situational awareness that made him valuable at the command post, and difficult to replace if killed or wounded. Captain Galt had been born in Geyser, Montana, on December 19, 1919. His father, Errol Fay Galt, worked as a bank cashier and later became vice president and eventually president of the First National Bank in Great Falls. His mother, Florence Eleanor Galt, had been a schoolteacher before marriage. William, known to his family as Bill, grew up in the ranching country of central Montana during the Depression years. He worked on ranches his father managed and on the ranches of his father's friends and clients, learning the practical skills of cowboy work, reading terrain, understanding the movement of animals, judging distances, calculating angles of approach. These were not abstract skills. A cowboy working cattle across broken country develops an intuitive understanding of geometry as applied to movement and position. He learns to read terrain not as a map but as a three-dimensional problem of sight lines, dead ground, and the relationship between position and control. He learns that controlling movement means controlling position, and controlling position means understanding the geometry of the ground. Galt attended college and received a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army. He joined the 34th Infantry Division when it was mobilized in early 1941 and deployed with the division to Northern Ireland in May 1942, making the 34th the first American division to reach the European theater. He landed in North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch and fought through the Tunisia campaign, where the division suffered heavy casualties, particularly at Fade Pass in February 1943, where the 168th Infantry Regiment lost half its strength. He fought through the invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno in September 1943 and through the grinding battles that followed: the Volturno River, the Winter Line, the assault on Cassino. He was wounded in action and hospitalized, returning to duty in February 1944. In March, the division was shipped to reinforce the embattled Anzio beachhead, where it spent 2 months under constant German artillery fire and air attack. By late April, Galt had been promoted to captain and appointed as the S3 for the 1st Battalion. A letter he wrote on May 11, 1944, reveals his state of mind. He expressed relief at no longer having direct command of soldiers, noting that not having to order men into combat removed a burden that had weighed on him increasingly as the casualties mounted and the familiar faces disappeared. On the morning of May 29th, after the 3rd failed assault on Villa Crochetta, Captain Galt left the battalion command post and moved forward to assess the situation personally. This was not unusual. Staff officers often moved forward to gather information that could not be adequately communicated over radio or telephone. What he saw confirmed what the reports had already indicated. The German position was too strong to be taken by infantry alone, the supporting artillery was insufficient to suppress the defensive fire, and another attack using the same tactics would produce the same result. The geometry of the battlefield was working entirely in favor of the defense. The German machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the only practical approaches. The trenches provided cover and concealment while allowing the defenders to engage targets at ranges where rifle fire was ineffective. The attacking infantry had no way to close the distance without being cut down by machine gun fire they could not suppress or avoid. The tactical problem required a solution that could alter the fundamental geometry of the engagement. The battalion had supporting armor attached, Company D of the 191st Tank Battalion and Company C of the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion. But by the time Galt moved forward, most of this armor support had been knocked out or had withdrawn. According to the Medal of Honor citation that would later be awarded to Galt, only one tank destroyer remained operational, and its crew had refused to advance farther. This requires context. Tank destroyer crews were not cowards, but they operated under a specific tactical doctrine that emphasized mobility and survival. Tank destroyers were designed to engage enemy armor from positions where their thin armor would not be a fatal liability. Advancing across open ground toward prepared infantry positions was not part of their mission profile, and it violated their training and doctrine. A tank destroyer advancing into close range of German infantry positions would be vulnerable to Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, magnetic mines, and close assault by infantry armed with explosives. The fact that the crew had refused to go forward indicates they understood the tactical situation and assessed the risk as unacceptable. They were probably correct by the standards of their training. Captain Galt made a decision that would cost him his life and break the stalemate on Hill 209. He approached the tank destroyer, climbed aboard, and ordered the crew to advance. The Medal of Honor citation states that he jumped on the tank destroyer and ordered it to precede the attack, language that suggests a degree of forceful intervention. Whether Galt invoked his authority as a staff officer, appealed to the crew's sense of duty, or simply demonstrated the willingness to lead from the most exposed position is not recorded. What is certain is that the tank destroyer began to move forward with Captain Galt in the turret, and a company of riflemen followed. The vehicle Galt rode was an M10 tank destroyer, officially designated the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10. The M10 was built on a modified M4 Sherman tank chassis and mounted a 3-inch M7 gun in an open-topped pentagonal turret. The open-top design was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed the crew to observe the battlefield more effectively and made the turret lighter and faster to traverse manually, but it also left the crew exposed to artillery airbursts, grenades, and small arms fire from elevated positions. The M10's armor protection ranged from 3/8 of an inch to 2 1/4 inches, with the thickest armor on the front glacis plate. This was adequate to defeat small arms fire and shell fragments, but was vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. The turret could be traversed only by hand, requiring approximately 2 minutes for a full 360-degree rotation, a significant limitation in close combat where targets might appear from multiple directions. The primary armament was the 3-inch M7 gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards at 30 degrees from vertical. Against German medium tanks like the Panzer Mark IV, this was adequate. Against heavier vehicles like the Panther or Tiger, the M10 required flank shots at closer range. The gun fired armor-piercing rounds that relied on kinetic energy rather than explosive filler, meaning they had limited effectiveness against infantry or soft targets. For anti-personnel work, the M10 carried a secondary armament, a 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun mounted on a pintle at the rear of the turret. The 50 caliber Browning was one of the most effective heavy machine guns of the war, firing a 1/2-inch diameter round at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,850 feet per second. It could penetrate light armor, destroy equipment, and was devastatingly effective against personnel. The gun had a cyclic rate of approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute depending on configuration, and it was normally fitted with ammunition belts holding 100 rounds, though longer belts could be assembled. The weapon was reliable, accurate at ranges exceeding a mile, and could maintain sustained fire as long as ammunition was available and the barrel did not overheat. As the M10 moved forward with Captain Galt manning the 50 caliber machine gun in the open turret, it became a focal point for German defensive fire. Small arms rounds and machine gun fire ricocheted off the armor. Galt stood fully exposed in the turret, firing the 50 caliber at German positions. The Medal of Honor citation describes him as ceaselessly firing his machine gun and tossing hand grenades into the enemy's zigzag series of trenches, despite the hail of sniper and machine gun bullets ricocheting off the tank destroyer. This was extraordinarily dangerous. A man standing upright in an open turret presents a large target, and the German defensive positions included multiple machine guns and riflemen. The fact that Galt was not hit during this phase of the attack was largely a matter of chance, though his continuous movement and the distraction of incoming fire on the vehicle itself may have degraded the accuracy of the defensive fire. The M10's main gun engaged a German anti-tank weapon, identified in the citation as a 77mm anti-tank gun. German 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank guns were common in defensive positions in Italy by May 1944, and they were lethal threats to Allied armor at ranges exceeding a mile. Galt located and directed fire on this gun and destroyed it, eliminating the primary threat to the tank destroyer and removing the weapon that could have stopped the attack entirely. With the anti-tank gun destroyed, the M10 could close with the German infantry positions without facing a weapon capable of penetrating its armor at range. The advance continued. The riflemen following the tank destroyer were now able to move forward under the cover of its fire and armor, using the vehicle as a mobile shield against the machine gun fire that had stopped the previous attacks. This was combined arms warfare as it was meant to function, armor suppressing defensive positions, while infantry exploited the suppression to close and assault. As the M10 approached the German trenches, Captain Galt made a tactical decision based on his understanding of terrain and geometry. The Medal of Honor citation states that, as the tank destroyer moved, Captain Galt so maneuvered it that 40 of the enemy were trapped in one trench. This single sentence describes a moment of tactical geometry that determined the outcome of the engagement. The German trenches on Hill 209 were designed in a zigzag pattern with multiple branches and traverses. This design prevented enfilade fire from sweeping the entire length of a trench and created compartmentalized fighting positions that could continue to resist even if part of the trench system was overrun. But the same design that protected the trenches from horizontal fire created a vulnerability to fire from above, particularly from a mobile platform that could position itself at the correct angle relative to the trench axis. Galt positioned the M10 so that its turret was directly over or immediately adjacent to a section of trench containing approximately 40 German soldiers. The geometry of the situation was simple and fatal. The Germans were in a linear trench with limited exit points, and a heavy machine gun was positioned to fire directly down the length of that trench. What happened next is described in the Medal of Honor citation with stark brevity. When they refused to surrender, Captain Galt pressed the trigger of the machine gun and dispatched every one of them. The word dispatched is a euphemism that obscures the physical reality of what occurred. A 50 caliber machine gun firing into a confined trench creates effects that are difficult to articulate in clinical language. The rounds penetrate human bodies, exit, and continue through multiple targets. In a confined space with no cover, there is no effective defense. The Germans in that trench were trapped by the geometry of their own defensive position. They could not exit the trench without exposing themselves to fire from other positions. They could not effectively return fire against a target elevated above them. They could not take cover within the trench because the trench itself had become a killing zone. The duration of the firing is not recorded, but a 50 caliber machine gun firing at cyclic rate would expend 100 rounds in approximately 10 to 15 seconds. Multiple bursts would be required to ensure that all targets were incapacitated. The fact that the citation specifies 40 casualties suggests either a body count conducted after the action or a report from surviving Germans who witnessed the event. Either way, the number indicates the completeness of the outcome. This action requires ethical and tactical consideration. By the laws of war as they existed in 1944, and as they exist today, soldiers who refuse an opportunity to surrender can be lawfully killed. The citation states the Germans refused to surrender, which creates a legally and morally distinct situation from firing on soldiers attempting to surrender or on prisoners already in custody. Whether the Germans actually refused surrender or were unable to hear or respond to a surrender demand in the chaos and noise of close combat is unknowable. What is certain is that Captain Galt and the soldiers with him believed the Germans had refused to surrender, and under the circumstances of close combat in a defended position, the decision to continue firing would have been considered legally and tactically justified. The alternative, attempting to physically enter the trench to accept surrender, would have exposed American soldiers to unacceptable risk. War creates situations where the range of moral choices narrows to decisions that would be unconscionable in any other context, and this was one of those situations. The immediate tactical result was the collapse of the German defensive position at that point in the line. With 40 defenders dead and their machine gun positions overrun, the integrity of the defensive line was broken. American infantry could now exploit the breach, enveloping adjacent positions and forcing the Germans to withdraw or be surrounded. The resistance that had stopped 3 previous attacks had been overcome, not through superior numbers or firepower, but through a tactical application of geometry that changed the fundamental relationship between attacker and defender. The civilian skills Captain Galt had learned on Montana ranches, the intuitive understanding of terrain and position and angles of approach, had translated directly into combat effectiveness at a critical moment. But the breakthrough came at immediate cost. The Medal of Honor citation concludes. A few minutes later, an 88mm shell struck the tank destroyer, and Captain Galt fell mortally wounded across his machine gun. The German 88mm gun was one of the most feared weapons of the Second World War, originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, but adapted for anti-tank and general fire support roles. Whether the gun that fired the fatal round was an 88mm flak gun in a ground role or an 88mm PaK-43 anti-tank gun is not specified, but the effect was the same. The round struck the M10 and detonated, and Captain William Wiley Galt died instantly or very shortly thereafter. He was 24 years old. The citation notes that he had personally killed 40 Germans and wounded many more, a clinical accounting that attempts to quantify the tactical impact of his actions. The notation that he fell across his machine gun suggests he died at his position in the turret, still manning the weapon that had broken the German line. The larger tactical and strategic consequences unfolded over the following days. The 168th Infantry Regiment continued its advance, taking Villa Crochetta and Hill 209. The 34th Infantry Division pushed forward across the Caesar line at multiple points. By June 2nd, the entire Caesar line had collapsed. The German 14th Army began withdrawing through Rome, and on June 4th, 1944, American forces entered the city. Rome became the first Axis capital to fall to Allied forces, a significant psychological and political victory, even if its strategic importance was debatable. The capture of Rome dominated headlines for 2 days until the Normandy landings on June 6 shifted the world's attention to France. Italy became a secondary theater, and the battles fought there, brutal as they were, faded from public consciousness. Captain William Wiley Galt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation, published in General Orders No. 1 on February 1, 1945, describes his actions at Villa Crochetta on May 29, 1944. The medal was presented to his widow, Patricia, at Great Falls Army Air Force Base in Montana on February 19, 1945, by Brigadier General Dale V. Gaffney. The ceremony was attended by his family and by representatives of the 34th Infantry Division. Newspaper accounts of the time described Galt as a hero who had sacrificed his life to break a critical German defensive position, and the language of heroism and sacrifice is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. The citation itself contains inaccuracies that reflect either incomplete information or the tendency of combat narratives to simplify events. The citation refers to a .30 caliber machine gun, when the weapon Galt used was a .50 caliber, a significant distinction in terms of the weapon's capabilities and effects. The citation describes the German anti-tank gun as a 77mm weapon, but German anti-tank guns in Italy in May 1944 were primarily 75mm Pak-40s or 88mm guns. 77mm would be an unusual caliber. These details matter to historians attempting to reconstruct events with accuracy, but they do not diminish the essential truth of what Galt did or the cost he paid. Captain Galt was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Great Falls, Montana. His grave is marked with a standard military headstone. Over the decades, his story faded from memory except among military historians specializing in the Italian campaign and among members of the 34th Infantry Division Association, veterans who maintained the history of their unit and honored their dead. By the 21st century, Galt's name was largely forgotten outside these small communities. The action at Hill 209 rated a footnote in divisional histories and occasionally appeared in accounts of the Anzio breakout, but it did not achieve the lasting prominence of other Medal of Honor actions from the war. This obscurity reflects several factors: the timing of Rome's fall just before D-Day, the perception of Italy as a secondary theater, and the uncomfortable nature of the action itself. Stories of heroism that end in death are easier to commemorate than stories of tactical killing at close range, even when that killing was legally and tactically justified. The broader lessons of Hill 209 were absorbed into American tactical doctrine, though not always explicitly attributed to this specific action. The need for combined arms cooperation at the tactical level, the vulnerability of prepared defensive positions to direct fire from armored vehicles at close range, the importance of exploiting terrain geometry rather than simply applying force frontally. All of these lessons appeared in post-war training manuals and tactical publications. The Army's evolving doctrine on infantry armor cooperation drew on hundreds of examples from the war, and Villa Crochetta was one small data point in a larger pattern. But the specific contribution of civilian experience to combat effectiveness, the way that skills learned in Montana ranch country translated into tactical competence on an Italian hillside, remained largely unexamined. The Army preferred to emphasize training and doctrine over intuition and improvisation, even though actual combat repeatedly demonstrated that trained soldiers who could think spatially and geometrically were more effective than soldiers who could only execute rehearsed procedures. The M10 tank destroyer itself became obsolete shortly after the war. By 1945, the Army had concluded that the separate tank destroyer force was not an efficient use of resources, and that regular tanks could perform anti-tank missions as effectively as specialized tank destroyers. The open-top turret, which had allowed Captain Galt to employ the .50 caliber machine gun with devastating effect, was seen as an unacceptable vulnerability, and post-war tank destroyer designs used fully enclosed turrets. Thousands of M10s were declared surplus and either scrapped or sold to Allied nations. A few survive in museums, restored to pristine condition that erases all evidence of the mud and blood and terror of combat. Visitors can read the specifications and admire the mechanical simplicity, but they cannot understand what it meant to stand in that open turret with machine gun rounds ricocheting off the armor, and the smell of cordite and burning metal in the air. The wheat fields on Hill 209 have long since been harvested and replanted countless times. The trenches that held 40 German soldiers for a few minutes on May 29, 1944, have eroded and filled in. The stone walls of Villa Crochetta still stand, though the buildings have been restored and no longer show evidence of combat damage. Tourists driving the road south of Rome pass through this landscape without knowing that men fought and died here, that tactical decisions made in moments of crisis changed the course of battles, and that battles changed the course of the war, and the war changed the world. The ground itself remembers nothing. Only documents preserve the memory, and documents are fragile things, subject to loss and decay, and the simple fact that most people do not read them. What remains is a question about the nature of warfare and the relationship between civilian skills and military effectiveness. Captain William Wiley Galt was not a professional soldier. He was a National Guard officer, a citizen soldier who learned his trade through training and experience rather than through the long apprenticeship of a military career. The skills that made him effective at the critical moment on Hill 209 were not skills the Army had taught him. They were skills he learned as a boy working cattle on Montana ranches, skills of spatial reasoning and geometry, and understanding how terrain and position determine outcome. The Army trained him to lead soldiers and to coordinate operations and to employ weapons, but it did not train him to see terrain the way a rancher sees terrain, as a three-dimensional problem of control and movement. That insight came from elsewhere, and it made the difference between failure and success on a day when 3 previous attacks had failed, and a 4th attack seemed certain to fail as well. Whether this matters, whether the source of tactical competence has any importance beyond its results, is a question each person must answer according to their own understanding of what war is and how it should be fought. But the fact remains that on May 29, 1944, a Montana rancher solved a tactical problem that had defeated 3 battalion-level attacks, and he did it by applying geometry rather than force. And then he died, and the Army continued its advance, and Rome fell, and Normandy happened, and the war went on without him. And eventually the war ended, and the veterans came home or stayed buried in foreign ground, and the decades passed, and the memory faded until almost no one remembered Captain William Wiley Galt, or Hill 209, or the 50 caliber machine gun that fired down into a trench and killed 40 men in less time than it takes to tell the story. If this story affected you, if you found yourself thinking about the geometry of warfare or the way civilian experience shapes military outcomes, or the simple fact that war creates situations where all choices are terrible choices, then subscribe to this channel and press the like button. More importantly, leave a comment answering this question. Do you believe Captain Galt's action, brutal as it was, represented the kind of courage and tactical innovation that deserves recognition, or does the nature of what happened in that trench make it something we should acknowledge but not celebrate? There is no easy answer, and that is precisely why the question matters. History is not a collection of comfortable stories about heroes. It is a record of what people actually did when faced with impossible situations, and sometimes what they did was necessary and terrible and worthy of respect and deeply disturbing all at once. Share your thoughts. Keep these stories alive. Remember the names. Captain William Wiley Galt, Hill 209, May 29, 1944.